Welcome to this deep dive where we take fascinating topics and unpack them for you. Today, we're looking at a really intriguing idea.
Hmm.
Could the 2040s be a significant period, maybe even a timeline to consider for the second coming of Jesus?
It's definitely a question that, well, it touches on centuries of theological interpretation,
Hmm.
and deeply held beliefs for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
It's crucial right off the bat to remember that the Bible, especially prophecy, it's understood in so many different ways.
Exactly. And to help us navigate this, we're diving into the work of author and blogger Samuel Tuominen,
Yeah.
specifically his blog post from April 12th, 2025. He looks closely at various interpretations of biblical prophecy, really focusing in on the fig tree prophecy.
A famous one, yeah.
Right. And our goal here, just to be clear, isn't to say this is it or this isn't it.
No, definitely not prediction.
It's about understanding the thinking, the logic behind this specific perspective that Tuominen lays out. We want to look at how different biblical scholars have approached these texts.
That's right. It's about exploring his reasoning, seeing how he connects the dots, really, without us necessarily, endorsing any single view is the answer.
Okay, so Tuominen's look into this, it's not something new for him, is it?
No, not at all. He mentions having this long-standing interest in eschatology, the study of end-time stuff, basically since he was young.
Right. And what's interesting is he talks about a shift in his own view over time, moving towards something maybe more hopeful.
Yeah, hopeful compared to, as he puts it, the climate anxiety that's so common today.
That's a really interesting contrast. It does make you wonder how current events kind of shape how we read these ancient texts.
It's a great point. His personal journey really gives context to his work, I think. It seems less driven by fear, doom and gloom scenarios,
Hmm.
and more from a desire to find maybe a positive framework, using prophecy to understand the future. He even mentions growing up Pentecostal and how some end times talk can maybe unintentionally cause anxiety.
Definitely see that. So he then gets right into the core of it, looking at the fig tree prophecy in Matthew 24, verses 32 to 34.
Yep.
Can you sort of break down the basics of that one for us?
Sure. So at its heart, Jesus uses this analogy, a fig tree. He says, when its branches get tender and put out leaves, you know summer is near.
Okay, a sign of the seasons changing.
Exactly. And right after that, he makes this really powerful statement. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place.
Ah, okay. And that's where the interpretation comes in.
That's the crux of it. As Tuominen explores, the key questions become,
Hmm.
what's the fig tree symbolizing and who exactly is this generation?
Right. And he brings in this view called the prophetic dispensationalist interpretation.
Hmm,
In this interpretation, the fig tree isn't just, well, a fig tree, it's a symbol for the nation of Israel.
correct. And the budding leaves.
That's the rebirth of the state of Israel in 1948. Yeah.
Yes. Which he sees as this huge pivotal moment, like a modern miracle. And he connects it back to prophecies in Ezekiel 36 and 37, which talk about Israel being restored.
It's like using a national symbol, like the bald eagle for the U.S. represents the whole country.
Exactly. The fig tree functions like that for Israel in this view.
And it's not just pulled out of thin air, right? There's biblical background for trees representing nations.
Oh, definitely. What makes this compelling for proponents is that biblical precedent. Tuamian points to examples like Ezekiel 31 comparing Assyria to a cedar,
Okay.
or Hosea 9 likening Israel to the first ripe fig. Even other New Testament stories involving actual fig trees in Matthew and Luke. So it's rooted in that kind of biblical symbolism,
But he's fair. He doesn't just present that one view. He also talks about the preterist interpretation. How's that different?
right? The preterist view. It takes a much more immediate historical angle. It understands Jesus as speaking directly to the people right there with him in the first century.
So this generation means them.
Exactly. Them. And all these things point primarily to events they, or many of them, would live to see, like the destruction of Herod's temple in 70 AD and the following exile.
Hmm.
Given Jesus' age, probably 30s, maybe early 40s,
Hmm.
and a typical lifespan back then, maybe 70 or 80 years, like Psalm 90 mentions,
Okay.
many in that original audience would have witnessed those events. So it sees the prophecy fulfilled much closer to Jesus' own time.
Okay, that makes sense as a different perspective. Now this brings us to this idea around the year 2028. Tuominen mentions a book by Taisho Kalevi-Lusa, The End of the World 2028. What was Lusa's argument there?
Well, Lusa was working within that dispensationalist framework we talked about.
Right, Israel as the fig tree, 1948.
Exactly. So he reasoned if the generation of the fig tree started, let's say, around 1948,
Okay.
and you use that 80-year lifespan figure from Psalm 90,
Hmm.
well, 1948 plus 80 years gets you to 2028. So that was suggested as a rough deadline for the second coming.
But Tuomitin pushes back on that 2028 idea pretty strongly, doesn't he? What are his main issues with it?
His primary critique is, well, the absence of several key events that are usually part of that dispensationalist end times timeline,
Like what?
like the 7-year tribulation period,
Yeah.
and the rise of the Antichrist figure, who was supposed to make a 7-year agreement with Israel.
Oh.
Since, writing in 2025, none of that had happened. Tuominen argues that a 2028 return just seems highly unlikely within that specific framework.
The timeline doesn't add up.
Right. He suggests even if you try to account for those missing 7 years, the absolute earliest you might possibly look would be like 2032.
Okay, that follows logically if you accept that sequence of events. But then Tuomitin really dives into this fascinating and tricky question. How long is a biblical generation? He mentions the 40-year idea from the Exodus.
Yes, that 40 years the Israelites wandered in the desert,
Mm.
Numbers 32.13 talks about that specific disobedient generation dying out.
Right.
And some people have used that 40-year number to calculate timelines. During the Cold War, for instance, it led to some speculation about the rapture or second coming happening by 1988.
Which is 40 years after 1948.
Exactly, 1948 plus 40.
But Tuomitin doesn't buy that 40-year interpretation. Why not?
He has a couple of key reasons. First, he argues that the 40 years in Numbers was a specific judgment for a specific group's disobedience. It doesn't automatically set a universal rule for how long all generations are.
Okay, context matter.
Right. And second, think about what Jesus said. This generation will not pass away until. That implies the generation would still be around, still recognizable, when the end events start.
And in 1988.
Well, the generation born around 1948 was just hitting middle age then, maybe around 40 years old.
Hardly passing away.
Exactly. It's hard to argue they were collectively passing away at that point. Many were still very much active in careers, raising families.
So he leans back towards that 70 to 80-year lifespan from Psalm 90 as maybe a more fitting measure.
Yeah, seems more relevant.
But even then, figuring out when a generation actually passes away,
Yeah.
It's not like everyone hits 80 and vanishes.
Absolutely not. It's much more nuanced. A generation fades out gradually. Tuominen uses the example of 2018. People born around 1948 turned 70 then. And sure, many retired, but you still had lots of influential world leaders and figures from that age group in major roles. He mentions Trump, Xi Jinping, Putin, Netanyahu, King Charles, Biden, all around that age bracket then
Yeah.
or now.
Good point. They were still very much present and active.
It shows that even at 70 or 80, a generation can still have a significant presence and impact.
And to really illustrate this, he includes some demographic data from the U.S. that was quite revealing.
Yes, that snapshot of the U.S. population by generation, I think it was, as of 2023. What's striking is just how large the baby boomer generation still is born 46 to 64.
Huge cohort.
Over 70 million people, something like 21% of the population. And importantly, they weren't even the oldest group. There were still millions from the silent generation and even earlier alive. It just shows how much longer people are living now.
And then there was that table showing the population decreased by age. What was the takeaway there?
What's really dramatic is the steep drop-off once you get into the very oldest age groups. You still have millions in their 80s, but the numbers fall off a cliff in the 90s. And by the time you're talking 110 or older, it's a tiny, tiny fraction. The table calls them biological outliers.
Statistically insignificant, basically.
Yeah, for practical purposes, as a noticeable group, their collective presence just isn't there anymore.
Okay, so let's connect this back to the fig tree generation. The ones born around 1948, maybe give or take a few years, say born in 1940, who would clearly remember 1948. How does this lead to an end to this 2040s deadline idea?
Okay, so Tuominen's logic follows this path. The fig tree generation, people born around 48 or maybe witnessing it as children in 48.
Right.
They'd be hitting their 90s in the late 2030s and early 2040s.
Getting up there.
Yeah. By around 2043, someone born in 1948 turns 95. And statistically, based on that population data, their cohort's numbers would be way, way down.
Becoming those statistical outliers.
Exactly. He talks about this idea of a lost generation, the few who live way beyond a century, kind of disconnected from the defining events of the generation before. So his argument is, if Jesus' return happened way out in the 2050s or later, the generation that actually saw the budding of the fig tree in 1948 would, for all practical purposes, be gone. their living memory wouldn't be a significant factor.
He uses that analogy like Jesus would miss the train.
Yeah, that's the phrase he uses, like waiting too long, missing the connection to that specific generation Jesus mentioned.
And that's what leads him to conclude the second coming should probably happen no later than the 2040s.
That's the core of it, to align with the idea that this generation will not pass away before it happens. He also brings in a couple of other sort of supporting points for that time frame.
Oh yeah, like what?
Well, he briefly touches on the idea that the Antichrist might rise by the 2030s. He draws a kind of loose parallel to Hitler's rise about a century earlier, seeing Hitler maybe as a foreshadowing.
Interesting parallel.
And he notes that Martin Luther, way back, had his own thoughts on end times, and some interpretations of Luther's writings apparently also pointed towards a similar time frame, around 2040.
Oh, Luther too.
Yeah. And one more thing Tuoman mentions in a follow-up, that he got feedback from a physics and math professor, Ramon Nunez.
Okay.
Apparently, Nunez provided some kind of astronomical evidence that also seemed to point to the 2040s as significant. Tuoman doesn't detail it in the post we're looking at, but it adds another sort of intriguing layer he considered.
Wow, okay. That's quite a confluence of ideas, biblical interpretation, demographics, history, even astronomy, potentially. So just to recap Tuoman's main thrust,
Yeah.
it really hinges on that dispensationalist view of the fig tree being Israel's rebirth in 48.
Correct. That's the anchor point.
And then applying a realistic, statistically informed view of when the generation that witnessed 1948 would effectively pass away,
Mm-hmm.
leading him to see the 2040s as the latest plausible window for the second coming to fulfill Jesus' words about this generation.
Precisely. He argues that by the time you get past the 2040s, that specific generation, in a meaningful statistical sense, would have passed away, which wouldn't fit the prophecy in his reading.
It's just so vital to remember, like we said at the start, this has been a deep dive into one specific interpretation.
Absolutely critical point.
Eschatology, end-time study, it's incredibly complex, incredibly diverse, so many different viewpoints, so many ways to read these prophecies.
A vast landscape of thought.
What we've done here is really unpack Samuel Tuomanen's particular line of reasoning, how he connects scripture, history, demographics. It's genuinely a thought-provoking example of how people grapple with these profound texts.
It is. What we explored today is one path someone took to draw connections between ancient words and our modern world, our potential future. It really encourages us, I think, to think critically about how we interpret prophecy, what assumptions we bring, the different lenses we can use.
So for you, our listener, as you think about all this, the different ways generation can mean different things, the historical backdrop, the variety of interpretations, what resonates, what questions pop up for you? We really hope you'll maybe check out Tuomanen's blog post itself, perhaps look into other perspectives on prophecy, and just continue your own thoughtful exploration of these deep, enduring questions. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.